What kind of fertilizer, the 1 to 2 cups, what kind of fertilizer do you put in there?
I use the Medina fertilizer.
The growing green?
Yeah, or actually their form of the growing green. We have an enhanced form of growing green. We call it Landscape Essentials. Basically, it's the same thing as growing green, but I think he's putting a little extra green sand in there, and I don't know what else, but just that stuff. If you get it here, that's what you get. Same price as a growing green, but if you have it elsewhere, growing green is what I would buy.
And you put that on the yard also.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
On the yard, on the ground covers, just about everywhere. I use it for just about everything. Okay, one more question.
So would you use both? I mean, you said the ladybug and the growing green, and would you use them both, or
Whatever, the ladybug is the compost.
Okay. Oh.
The growing green is the fertilizer. So yes, very definitely use both. Okay, yes sir.
Like if you use lava sand, how do you have to renew it, or do you have to renew it?
Lava sand brings some additional qualities to the soil. Well, lava sand helps with keeping more moisture in the soil and provides something we call paramagnetism, which I won't go into that discussion, but helps things grow a little bit better. If you apply lava sand, you ought to be putting it on once at least every 500 years. It does last for a little while. Okay, what's everybody's favorite vegetable? Tomatoes? We talk about tomatoes? Okay. A few secrets to growing tomatoes. Number one, when you plant them, tomatoes are one plant that you can plant deeper than the plant is already growing. You know, we talk about most plants, if you pile soil up around the trunk, it's going to rot and cause problems. When you bury tomato plants deeper, they grow roots all the way up and down the stem. So if you've got big old tall lanky plants, bury them way down in the ground. If you can't dig a hole that deep. Years ago when I worked with Alton, we had some commercial growers that came in, and they always wanted to buy our overgrown tomato plants. I said, how on earth are you going to plant them? Well, I had two different people tell me two different things. One guy said, oh, I let them get so dry they go limp, and I just coil them up in the hole and fill the soil in over. The other guy said, I dig a trench, lay them down sideways, and just turn the top up and fill it in. But tomatoes you can plant deep, and if you want the best plants, you will plant them deep. Tomato plants are susceptible to a problem which is called blossom end rot. I'm sure most of y'all have seen it on your neighbors' gardens. It is like where the bottom of the tomato it starts out turning kind of watery, and then it eventually turns black and shrivels up a little bit. It looks ugly. You can cut the bottom off and, you know, still eat the tomato if you like. You think, oh, I'd never do that. Go eat tomato soup. You know what happens to all the bad tomatoes that don't make it to the shelf? They get turned into tomato soup. But anyway, blossom end rot is not a disease. Blossom end rot is due to an imbalance of two materials, one calcium and the other magnesium in the soil. We balance the soil, at least I do when I plant tomatoes, with Epsom salts. Just go to the drugstore, the grocery store, wherever, and get common old Epsom salts. And when you plant tomatoes, add a little bit of Epsom salts. Now don't put it in the hole, because this is not something that is taken up by the plant. This is something you're actually using to change the chemical composition of the soil. In this case, take it and just sprinkle it around. I cover an area about this big. For those of y'all that were looking down. And I'll just grab a handful of it. I mean, I'm very, very scientific. I measure everything exactly right. Now, I grab a handful of it and go down where I'm going to plant each individual tomato plant. And I don't ever have blossom end rot. It's as simple as that. If you have a neighbor that comes to you later and says, I've got blossom end rot, what do I do? Well, you take those same Epsom salts and dissolve some in a bucket of water, about 2 tablespoons to a gallon of water. Go water the plants with that. It won't cure the tomatoes that are already going bad, but the new tomatoes that come out afterwards will pretty much be free of the problem. Second thing we do when we plant tomatoes, when you dig that hole, in the bottom of the hole, put a handful of phosphate, either rock phosphate or what we call colloidal clay phosphate. And you don't want to mix it through the soil. Again, I'll tell you Malcolm Beck's story. He had heard about this, and he did this. He put a handful of phosphate in the bottom of the hole. Malcolm has a lot more time than I do, and so he weighed. He had one row where he used this and one row where he didn't. He weighed the tomatoes that came off of each plant, that came off of each row. The row where he used the rock phosphate, he got twice as many pounds of tomatoes as he did off the row where he didn't. So he got dollar signs in his eyes, ordered about 4 tons of rock phosphate, and plowed it into his whole field there. You know how much his tomato production increased? 0. Because when you mix the phosphate with the soil, it gets tied up in our alkaline soils. It gets tied up in a form that plants can't absorb and use. This is why you put it in a big clump. We put a handful of it in the bottom of the hole, then plant on top of it. The roots go down through it. Doesn't have a chance to get, tied up in the soil. So put a handful of it in the bottom of the hole, and then plant your tomato plant directly on top of it.
Yes.
And that's something you get at a nursery?
Any good nursery.
Like here.
That's a code word for shades of green.
Yes.
But anyway, I would say any good nursery. Let me tell you one more thing first. If you want to join me in experimenting this year, not the right stuff.
No.
Well, somewhere we've got a bag of it. Nature's Guide has come out with a new product. I'm going to make a tiny little hole in this and look and see if this is what I think it is, or if it is truly just the rock phosphate. They have come out with a rock phosphate. By the way, don't use superphosphate. Use the rock phosphate. It's much, much better product. And what does this look like?
That's really the secret.
Yeah. This is their a new rock phosphate that they have taken and coated with molasses. Now, I have a question. Is that going to be too much molasses for the roots of the plants? I don't know. But when I plant in my garden, I'll have 2 rows of tomatoes, and on this side I'll have the same variety as I do on this side, but I'll be experimenting with something. I'll put something on one and not on the other. I'm going to be experimenting with a bunch of this molasses-coated rock phosphate, so if you want to try the same, I don't know. It sounds like a good idea, but whether it's going to be a good thing or not, we'll see. Yes, sir?
As an alternative, you take some of that molasses, dry molasses, and mix it with the phosphate, or will that?
I wouldn't hurt anything if you just used a little bit of it. But so far as I can tell, their molasses-coated rock phosphate is going to be as cheap as a regular rock phosphate.
I
So.
mean, you have both separate right now, and you don't want to go out and buy a...
Yeah, just mix them up, sure. Yeah, or just use your, don't even mix them up, use your rock phosphate, just use a lot of the dry molasses around. Okay, other things about tomatoes, plant lots of different kinds. I can tell you some very good tomato varieties, but the variety that was outstanding last year may not produce as well this year. The variety that was so-so last year might or might not be a really good variety for this year. So I always plant lots of different varieties of tomatoes. And tomatoes are generally classified to their growth habit as to whether they're called determinate, indeterminate, or semi-determinate. And basically, I guess you need to know what those terms mean. Indeterminate means that it grows like a vine. And it just keeps on growing on and on and on and on. Somebody told me they were driving over the big island of Hawaii, and they saw this tomato plant growing by the side of the road, sprawling along the ground. He said it was the same tomato plant, and he measured 2 miles down the road that this one plant was growing. So it grows as long as you will let it grow. That is an indeterminate tomato, and it obviously can put on a lot of fruit if conditions are right. Determinate tomatoes grow to a certain size and stop growing. And once you get one good crop off a determinate tomato, you might as well pull it up and discard it. Why would you ever want that, you say? Well, you know, the people that grow tomatoes don't pick them by hand anymore. They're picked by a machine. They grow them up to a certain size, the machine goes through the field and rips the plant up and takes the tomatoes off of it, and that's it. Then they plant more plants. So they want a plant that produces all of its fruit at one time. I don't. I want a tomato that continues to produce over a longer period of time. A semi-determinate, as the name might imply, you know, is going to fall somewhere in the middle. It will continue to grow, but not quite like a vine would. Now, one difference in large fruited tomatoes and small fruited tomatoes. Your larger fruited tomatoes are sensitive more so to nighttime temperatures as far as setting fruit. They won't set fruit if it's too cold. They won't set fruit if it's too hot. That's why your bigger fruited tomatoes, there's that window of time in the spring when it's the Goldilocks effect. Everything is just right. That your tomatoes will set lots and lots of fruit. But your bigger fruited varieties, especially if you're listening to Jerry Parsons, your 444, so many of the ones he promotes, these are determinate big fruited tomatoes. And once they make that first set of fruit, that's all you're getting until the nights cool down in the fall. So I always plant a combination of large fruits and small fruits because the cherry tomatoes aren't nearly as picky about nighttime temperatures. And they will typically produce all through the summer months without regard to how warm the nights get or how cool the nights are once it's up to a certain temperature. So I believe in planting a big mixture of both cherries and the bigger tomatoes. Again, I will plant several varieties for a number of reasons. It seems like, some years one variety just produces extremely well.